Orban's great bombard fired more than 1,000 pounds of stone against the walls of Constantinople, and the largest gun ever cast was meant to end 1,000 years of empire in a single spring. By April of 1453, the cannon's thunder rolled across the Marmara coast every day, a sound no city had ever endured. For decades, historians have treated the fall of the Eastern Roman capital as a foregone conclusion, a brittle relic waiting for gunpowder to finish it. But the siege of 1453 was never a certainty. It was a contest of failures, and the smallest crack could have decided everything. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Mehmed II was 21 years old, Sultan since 1451, and consumed by a single ambition his father Murad had abandoned. He encircled the city by land and sea, his army numbering many tens of thousands against a garrison of only a few thousand soldiers and a handful of Italian volunteers. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of the Romans, refused every offer of surrender and took his place personally on the ramparts. The triple Theodosian Walls, which had turned back attackers for nearly 1,000 years, were his greatest ally. Across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the defenders stretched a heavy iron chain, the boom, to seal the inner harbor from the Ottoman fleet. Mehmed answered by hauling part of his fleet overland on greased rollers, sliding warships into the horn behind the chain. The trap was nearly complete, but what no one inside or outside those walls yet understood, what would not become clear until the final dawn, was that the weapon meant to break the city carried the seed of the city's survival inside its own iron. At dawn on May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched the general assault he believed would be the last. Wave after wave of irregulars, then Anatolian regiments, then the elite Janissaries threw themselves at the battered Mesotation where the great cannon had done its work. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese captain entrusted with the wall defense, held the breach with a discipline that steadied the whole line. And then the bombard spoke for the last time. Orban's gun had always been prone to overheating, demanding long hours of cooling between shots, and on that morning the crews pushed it past its limit. The barrel cracked along its length with a roar, splitting iron and killing the men who served it. The bombardment that was supposed to shatter the final defense fell silent at the very moment it was needed most. The walls held. The defenders who had braced for the killing blow found the breach defensible after all, and Giustiniani, wounded historically and carried from the field, stayed at his post this time and held the morale of the garrison intact. As the assault faltered, sails appeared on the Marmara. Genoese relief galleys, dispatched at last, drove toward the harbor mouth, struck the boom under cover of the confusion, and broke it. The ships that had been hauled into the Golden Horn now found themselves scattered and exposed. By midday, the great assault had collapsed into a bloodied retreat. The certainty of conquest was gone. The season was turning, and Mehmed's army was no longer the confident host that had arrived in April. Casualties mounted, the treasury bled, and the failure of the wonder weapon had punctured the aura of inevitability the young Sultan needed to hold his coalition together. He lifted the siege and withdrew toward Edirne. At his court, the Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, who had counseled caution from the beginning, pressed his case with renewed authority. The cost had been ruinous. The city had proven it could still bleed an empire white. Renewing the campaign at once, Halil argued would gamble the dynasty's prestige on the same walls that had just humiliated it. For now, the argument held. Mehmed, brilliant and patient, chose to wait. The consequences of that pause would ripple across a century. But first, we need to understand what the breathing space allowed Constantinople to become. Constantine and the Ilinths understood exactly what had saved his city, not divine favor, but a cracked barrel and a Genoese sail arriving on time. He resolved that survival would never again depend on luck. The emperor parlayed the city's endurance into deeper ties with the Latin West, with Genoa and Venice and the papacy in Rome, where the news of a Christian capital that had held against the Turk arrived like a miracle. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate bound to the contested Union of Florence, became a conduit for more than theology. Founders and gun casting techniques flowed eastward in exchange for trade concessions and the promise of a bulwark against Ottoman expansion. Slowly, deliberately, Byzantium built an artillery train of its own. The empire that had nearly died to a single great cannon now cast its own guns along the Theodosian Walls, learning the metallurgy that had so nearly destroyed it. This was no sudden transformation. It took years of patient negotiation, foreign craftsmen, and hard coin the empire could barely spare. But by stages, the last Roman city entered the Gunpowder Age as a participant rather than a victim. Mehmed II remained the most formidable ruler of his age, and his ambition never cooled. But the Bosphorus choke point stayed shut to him, and a fortified Christian capital sat astride the strait that linked his European and Anatolian holdings. Unable to swallow Constantinople, he turned to what he could take. He consolidated his grip across Anatolia and pushed by land into the Balkans, against Serbia, against the Morea, against the Hungarian frontier. Yet every westward thrust dragged against the weight of an enemy capital on his flank, a city that could harbor fleets and rally Latin aid. The pivot into Europe that history remembers as swift and inexorable came slower here, contested at every river and pass, because the hinge of two continents had refused to fall. The exodus of Greek learning to Italy had already begun long before 1453. Scholars carrying classical manuscripts had been crossing the Adriatic for generations, feeding the hunger of Italian humanism. That migration did not stop, but its character changed. With the empire intact and the libraries of Constantinople still standing, fewer men of letters fled, as refugees clutching what they could carry. Some remained to teach in a surviving city, their academies funded by an emperor who grasped that learning was a form of power. Others still traveled west, but as paid visitors and honored guests, ambassadors of a living tradition rather than mourners of a dead one. The texts still moved, the exchange still flowered, and then came the divergence that would shape the intellectual map of Europe for the next 200 years. Byzantium never recovered the vast territories of its golden centuries. It remained modest, hemmed in, perpetually short of money and men. But behind modernized walls and its own cannon, it endured as something Europe had not seen in generations, an Orthodox great power that negotiated as an equal. It bargained with Venice and Genoa over trade, with Rome over the still unhealed schism between the churches, and with the Sultan over the long Ottoman frontier. It anchored a sphere, Orthodox in faith, Greek in letters, pragmatic in diplomacy, that the Latin West could neither absorb nor ignore. The Union of Florence remained contested, never fully accepted by a populace that resented Latin terms, and that tension shaped Byzantine politics for decades. The empire's strength was no longer its armies. It was its position, its learning, and the simple, stubborn fact of its survival. The deepest change was the one that never made a single dramatic scene. In our history, Constantinople became Istanbul, the Ottoman capital from which Mehmed's heirs pressed to the gates of Vienna, and the flood of Greek refugees into Italy is woven into the standard story of the Renaissance. In this timeline, Europe's eastern edge is a contested frontier rather than an Ottoman capital, and the Renaissance is fed by exchange instead of exodus. None of it was inevitable. It turned on an overheated barrel, a captain who did not fall, and galleys that reached the boom in time. Empires are not destroyed by destiny, they are destroyed by the accumulation of small failures, and they survive by the narrowest of margins. The walls held because the gun broke first, and in that single morning of cracked iron and broken chain, 1,000 years of Roman continuity bought itself another age, not because it was meant to, but because, for once, the failures fell the other way.